Hey friend, in this video, we are beginning the painting process of our juicy detailed watercolor peony. This has been part 3 of a 4-part series where we're painting the cover of my second book, Everyday Watercolor Flowers, with this really detailed, really fun floral. And it's gonna look something like this at the end. Next week's video is gonna be the final details and the leaves and all of that. But today, in today's video, we're gonna be doing the first layers. The wet and wet background backdrop. We're also gonna do the wet and wet layers on the petals and how to approach each individual petal by adding midtones and shadows and diffusing color. A lot of really good foundational techniques are explored here in this video today. So if you need help with painting more detailed flowers or even just working on your technique, this video is going to cover a lot of really good stuff for you today. So let's dive in. Okay, so in today's video, we are starting the painting process for this big, juicy, fluffy peony. I have spent 2 other videos previous to this one breaking down my process of the overall shape of this flower being that olive shape or that 3-dimensional spherical shape. I also broke down my process for petals and the 5 different shapes that I use for all different types of petals. All you have to do is change the contour and the angle or arc of the C-curve. And so if you're not familiar with how to sketch a flower like this, a little bit more detailed flower like this, please go back to the previous 2 videos to really get an understanding of where we're at in the process. I have finalized my sketch of my flower, and I am going to start with a big wash in this pinky hue because my flower is going to be this pink color. We're basically expanding on the cover art of my second book, Everyday Watercolor Flowers, of this particular flower, but updating it with a little bit more expansive petals, and then also the color is going to be slightly different. So it's going to be a more pinky corally color, I think. So when I want to have this kind of blurry, fun, washy background on my paintings, I'll take my mottler brush or just some sort of big flat brush. This is the Aqua Elite from Princeton mottler brush. It's one of my favorites for big washes. And I'm just gonna cover my whole sheet of paper, even the flower, with water, mostly clean water, with this thin glaze. So we don't want any areas to be too puddly or too watery, but we also don't want it to be too thin so that it dries really quickly. And I'm actually just gonna start my base layer with wet and wet technique. And I want it to expand beyond the edges of the flower so that it feels like it's fading into the distance and maybe there's more flowers in the background. So everything is really wet. Every inch of my paper is really, really wet. So I'm working very quickly. And I'm also going over areas where it seems like it's getting a little bit matte or dry and just making sure that it stays wet. I want this to stay wet for the next at least 10 minutes so that I can add in color, but making sure that the color that I do add is very light and very transparent at this stage. And I'm doing mostly pinks, corally pinks, so pink mixed with a little bit of yellow or orange. And I'm just going to lighten that color, make sure to get rid of excess water off on the edge of my paper towel so I'm not bringing in more water. And I'm just gonna start by washing in this color on the flower, but then also outside of the flower so that we get some of that faded, blurred look. The center of my flower is going to have the highest concentration of my pink color, so I can go in there, but I don't want to cover up my flower too much with color. I'm gonna put some over here and maybe even some purples for shadow, a shadow color. And if something is a little bit too dark or too crazy, just grab clean water and dry it off on your paper towel and just kind of lift it and spread it around a little bit more. That purple color is a nice shade for this background. And I can tilt my paper to make that a little bit more organic looking. So just really faded right now, but around this second section of my oval is where I want a little bit more concentrated color to show through. So I know I can add in a little bit more color here, but leave this opening of the olive. If you missed last video, then that won't make sense, but this little opening of my olive, a little bit more pale. And if something goes a little too far or I want to lift any color, I'll just dry and clean my brush off and dry it off and lift the color off. So for example, right here, I maybe want this to be a little bit lighter, and just kind of playing with these really light colors. Maybe add in some more purple to the background over here. And darker corner down in here with this purple. So we're going to drag this all the way down. Meet the edge of these petals over here. Since this is starting to dry a little bit more, it's not going to spread as much, so I can be a little bit more close up to my petals if I want. And then we'll add some more purple to this edge up here too. Blend that in a little bit. Take some water and blend it up a little bit more, but make sure you don't have too much water because you're gonna have those cauliflowers or hard lines come through. And that's pretty good. A little bit more pinks in here. Soften that. Control it a little bit and blend it. So you're kind of just starting to color this in a little bit, and I can even start to add some of my details at this stage, but we're going to add a lot more in the next lesson. But I'm just, while it's still wet, kind of just bringing up those confident strokes with my size 12 round brush, or a size 16 round brush works as well. And just kind of guiding that color a little bit better while it's still just a tad wet. To give it some of those really fun, blurry details. And then, while it's still a little bit wet, we're gonna do a little bit of the wet and wet process for pulling out some midtones. So I've got my pink hues, my pinky corally hues. I can mix orange and pink or yellow and pink for that corally vibe. And this consistency right here would be a little too thick and dark for adding it at this stage. We want to wait for those really thick, gorgeous, bold colors for when everything is dry, and that will be in the next video. So I'm going to take this color, rinse it off a little bit, and make sure to get rid of the excess water on my paper towel. And I'll even dab off some of the color on my towel too, to really make sure that I'm not adding too much color to the painting at this stage. Everything is done extremely light. And I'm taking a smaller brush and just starting to drag in some of these darker tones. You can start with just going around the edge of where a petal is being overlapped and bring it up. And the stroke for my details is kind of a flatter slanted hold, like 25 degrees away from the paper. Press and flick up, and make sure to follow that curve of the edge of the petal like we discussed in the previous videos. And you don't want to cover every inch of the petal with the darker color because you want to show those purples underneath and those lighter tones underneath. Go in here and accentuate that. So it's a really almost simple process, or a loose style process for a detailed looking peony or a rose or whatever flower you're painting. And a lot of it is done in the wet and wet stage, but we want to start to separate our petals from each other at this point by adding in some of those darker colors. And anywhere you see a petal being overlapped is a good indication of where there would be more midtones or shadows. And I'll even take a clean, damp brush and massage the color in a little bit better, or you can lift the color if it's too much. And maybe some of this purple. And if this looks overwhelming at this stage, just keep in mind that every single petal should be treated like its own individual painting. So just start with the concentrated area of your petals. Where you're going to want to see a lot more midtones and shadows is going to be right around the opening of the oval, because there's a lot more going on, a lot more overlapping and all of that. So I'm adding most of these colors at this stage around that oval opening. And just kind of treat each petal as its own individual painting. So for example, on this petal, I'll go right up to the edge where it's being overlapped and I'll accentuate or overlap those pencil marks. And then I'll just deepen the color a little bit and bring it up a little bit more. And then release that color from my brush with water and dab the excess and just kind of blend it up the petal so that it gets lighter and more faded as we get to the edge of the petal. And so that's really all I'm doing at that stage, or at this stage, is accentuating where there's overlaps. Maybe bring this on the butt of this petal and up, rinsing that off and then guiding it up. Finding that top edge. Rinsing it off, guiding it up. And your color can overlap and not be so clean at this stage because we're going to add, with wet on dry in the next video, we're going to add crisper details that makes each petal pop. Put this in right here to make it a little bit more separate from that fold. And now we're starting to slowly see the individual petals peeking out. Little shadow on this edge over here where this petal is overlapping this one in a slightly different hue. So I have a little bit more of a purple on this side to separate this shadow from this shadow. So I'm making sure to go between those two different hues so that it doesn't all just blend and become one big petal. Adding some shadow back here to separate those rows. Rinse and blend. It requires a lot of patience at this stage, but it starts to become a flower as you're gradually adding in those slightly darker hues along those pencil lines that you have to show the separate petals. You can even go on the bottom edge of some of these wave-shaped petals and add the shadow line to that bottom curve and maybe up a little bit. And then rinse off that color, dry off your brush so it's just a clean, slightly damp brush, and just massage that in until it fades towards the edge. So that lighter edge on the top part of this petal right here is what's going to separate this top part from adding in more dark shadow right up against that pencil line in the next stage, which is going to make this feel darker than this, showing that curve better. And I'll go up on this curve too and add that main shadow line, grab water and pull it down to blend. Pulling that color so that it's a smooth gradient all the way to the edge of the tip of the petal, and then I'll darken this center point right here where it kind of comes in, and over here a little bit too. Now, I think we can call it a day on the wet and wet detail that we just added. We want to keep it really light, so especially around these edge petals, I want those to feel almost white. So we don't have much color going on those. Most of the color is concentrated towards the middle of the flower, and then we're gonna wait for this to dry. And in the next video, I will show you my wet on dry detail process for making this pop. We're gonna add some leaves and really complete this painting. As always, thank you so much for watching our videos, for liking and for subscribing to our channel, for downloading our freebies. If you are getting started with your watercolor journey and you need a little bit of extra assistance, make sure you check out my 40-page free ebook called The Complete Beginner's Guide to Watercolor. It has tons of really good stuff in there and it's freaking free. So the link to that will be below. And next week, get really excited for next week's video where we are completing this piece and doing more of that step-by-step process of adding the details, adding the leaves, and really making this flower really pop off the page. So I hope you loved this week's video. Let me know in the comments below what your favorite part of today's video was, and I will see you next week in the final piece.